So, hi everyone. I'm here with Frank Brown today, who's the director of GRR Consulting. So, we know Frank from a lot of your previous work and a lot of your speaking, particularly around regulatory interactions in the UK market. So thanks very much for joining me today. And I thought it'd be great just to find out a little bit about what you've been up to, but also what's the latest happening from a regulatory point of view as well.
Yeah, hi. Good to see you again. Yes, it is as it always is, a sort of busy time for firms on a regulatory basis. I mean, the one that is capturing most people's focus at the moment is consumer duty, and that is perhaps somewhat overshadowed some other regulation as well. I mean, things like operational resilience, the sort of anniversary of that passed without comment, really, because people were so focused on the consumer duty side of things, and a lot of challenges with firms, certainly, both in the interpretation of the rules and also in the implementation of the requirements.
So just on consumer duty, we've got the final implementation date, which is like the 31st of July.
Ooh,
I mean,
yeah.
how are you finding the readiness of firms, at least the ones you've been speaking to, because you've got wide context across the industry? I mean, how's the implementation going for most folks you chat to?
I'd have to say there are challenges, without question. I mean, it's a mix of challenges. It is challenges in interpretation. So what does this actually mean for us? What's in scope? What do we need to do? And equally, challenges in implementation, how far down that journey we are. And we had a milestone recently. We had the April milestone recently, which again seemed to pass without comment, where the expectation was manufacturers should be passing a lot of detail on to distributors if you had that kind of relationship. And talking to distributors in particular, not a lot of communication from manufacturers, unfortunately. Not a lot of information being passed down.
What do you think the hold-up is? I mean, in terms of like the implementation, because it is quite a fundamental change that's going through. I mean, what do you think? What's the hold-up? What do people find most difficult?
There is a degree of, I mean, change management and the sort of Kubler-Ross journey of denial, anger, despair, or whatever, and there is still a
lot of
degree.
Despair normally. So.
Yeah, there's an awful lot of despair, but equally a fair degree still of denial as well.
Right.
I mean, that's hump of it's not TCF 2.0. It is different, and we do need to do things differently, is perhaps not being sold in effectively within firms, and particularly within operational departments of firms. I mean, again, classic change management, you have to get people to believe a change needs to happen before they will follow you on that journey.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely coming down the pipe of this, isn't it? Sometimes you've got to almost like feel the flames from the fire or the train that's coming towards you before things actually happen. I mean, but it's definitely happening. I mean, you say the first deadline's passed. I mean, although the most recent deadline's passed. I mean, it's getting nearer and nearer. Do you think it's a matter of sort of like there's going to be a rush to do everything at the end, or do you think there's going to be potentially people who aren't ready?
I think without question there will be a proportion of people who are not ready.
Yeah,
that is just reality, and I think a lot of firms are recognising the fact in themselves and thinking about the sort of triage activities they can be doing between now and July. And back to the sort of despair concept, just because you're not 100% ready doesn't mean you shouldn't be charging forward and trying to get as far as you can.
I mean, I was on a webinar earlier in the week, and there was discussion around consumer duty, and it did seem like there was a readiness even from the regulator. So like, if you're making progress and you've actually invested in it, there's a little bit of sympathy that will there, because you're having that dialogue with them. It's almost like it feels like the worst thing to do is to just pretend it's not going to happen and then have done nothing. I mean, that seems like that's a worst case scenario. But at least if you start and you're having a dialogue with the FCA, then you're starting on that journey. I mean, is that kind of a fair observation?
Yes, and I mean, if we're talking about milestones, there was obviously the October milestone as well, which many firms didn't reach, and that was the one where the expectation that the board should be presented with the plan. And if a regulator were coming in on the 1st of August to look at a firm, they would be asking questions about, okay, let's have a look at the plan, let's have a look at what the board were doing, what resources were put against this. And if you had a good plan, you have been working towards it, but just genuinely you've not made the progress that you thought you were going to make, that is a degree of mitigation. Conversely, if your plan for October was fairly shaky and you haven't devoted resources, you've been focused on that shiny project you always wanted to be doing at the same time, as opposed to this, it becomes more challenging.
Yeah. There's a bit of human interaction that's going on there, isn't there, to a certain extent?
Yeah. And, as always, without wishing to say the sky is falling in or scare people, the regulator has devoted a remarkable amount of resource to consumer duty. You look at the amount of material they put out there, the podcasts, etc., the way they built it into their 3-year plan. So it would be surprising if they did not use it.
Yeah, and in terms of the implementation process, I mean, what are the elements that are probably people finding most difficult to put in? I mean, you've got policy changes, you've got product changes, you've got evidencing that needs to be built. I mean, all of these things need to be built by the deadline for implementation. I mean, which bits do you think are the most tricky and are probably the biggest struggle that you've really got to concentrate on first and think about deeply?
I mean, there are many struggles. I suppose the biggest process issue is, well, there's a couple of process issues. One, not fully engaging the first line and not getting the first line to drive this. I mean, too many projects are compliance-led, compliance-driven, which just isn't going to work. These are operational changes you need to make in the business. So that side of things, and back to my point around, have you spent that time to convince or educate first line why this is important? So you got that side of it. A lot of people also not particularly focusing on the cross-cutting rules as well.
Okay.
So very, customer understanding outcome, service outcome, etc., etc. But the cross-cutting rules are, I always describe them as the principle of the principles.
Yeah.
If you look at foreseeable harm, I strongly suspect that when enforcements come down the pike, it is going to be foreseeable harm. Yeah.
The cross-cutting roles are almost like the most interesting bit. So you've got sludge practices, foreseeable harm, and if you look at them, I mean, they're interesting to like how would that actually then interact with the business, and how would you do that? And I almost feel like they're the more complex piece, and it can certainly generate a lot of change because they're quite detailed and have a lot of sort of ramifications across multiple processes.
Yeah, absolutely, and they go to the heart of where the regulator came from. The regulator, in many respects, the sort of gestation of this was the FCA repeatedly thinking, oh, for God's sake, can you just not do that? When you create new products, processes, etc., not thinking about the underlying rules. So that frustration that the regulator was thinking that they were playing whack-a-mole in the market when something new happens. So flipping it on its head to, you firm must think about the impact of the future, the foreseeable harm for the customer.
Yeah, it's interesting. We were just chatting about the difference between markets before this in terms of like what would happen if we didn't have the regulation, and what is the impact that regulations potentially had on the business and business processes really for a good thing, in terms of like, has it driven us to more digital? Has it driven us to different ways of working? Which I think is quite an interesting sort of thought exercise in terms of, yes, I know there's a lot to do, but then has it actually changed our processes for the better? Even if you look back over the last 5 years, I'm not sure where you think of that, because there's like this loop, isn't there, between regulation and development, and it does help us push the business forward in many ways.
Yeah. And I often present a sort of utopian scenario to firms of a concept of, you shouldn't really think about your second line. You should think about operating without a second line in place. Your first line people should know the rules, know the regs, know the right thing to do. And yes, it is a utopian concept, but if you think about it in those terms of, that's where the risk driver should be, that's where the cultural change should be in the organisation, with second line, third line, just the guidelines of what's happening.
Yeah, it's interesting. It sounds like there's a lot to do, and I suppose and the other topic which we were originally going to talk about was operational resilience as well. So I mean, that's also going on in the background, which feels like that's been a little bit under the radar to a certain extent. Although we did have the first deadline, was it March 22?
Yeah, so March 22 came in, and then March 23, obviously a year in. I mentioned earlier the classic bit of Cinderella regulation that just not been mentioned at all by anybody, and a significant risk to organisations who are in scope, because similar to consumer duty and perhaps a new trend for the regulator, a very strong focus on the board must review this, the board must own this.
Yeah.
So if you think about the linkage with SMCR, you have people in SMF positions who will be potentially challenged on reasonable steps here when the inevitable banking failure happens, IT failure happens. So there's an enormous amount of baked-in risk with operational resilience.
I mean, one of the challenges with it is you don't realise you need some of the resilience until it actually happens, and then it will be like, why wasn't this done years ago, sort of thing. So, for example, if you have an IT breach or an IT failure, or if you have a cyber attack, something like that. I mean, it's only after it happened then it comes out as like all of these things needed to be done. I mean, how do you get beyond that to sort of making sure that people are doing it? Because we've always had BCP plans, and it's just making sure that we're testing some of those, making sure that they're robust enough, I would think.
Yeah, and again, it comes back to the sort of making it real concept. I mean, boards with the self-assessment documentation, boards have effectively done an attestation here to say my business is in this state, my controls are in this state, and as you say, if the inevitable failure happens, then the first thing a sensible supervisory team from the regulator will say, okay, let's have a look at your self-assessment. Why did you not think this was an important business service? Why did you think that was a reasonable impact tolerance for this? Show me the evidence, show me the discussions that you had internally, which will be painful, awkward questions.
I mean, you think about some of the large particularly IT outages that we've had. So thinking about like in the airline industry, I mean, not just in the UK, but in other markets around the world, just how painful that is and how brand damaging that is as well. So as I was looking through the regulation, I mean, part of it was setting tolerance levels. So it felt like that was done in a more detailed way than you would have done on BCP plans, as an example. And it had a lot more rigor around BCP plans. And going back to what we were talking about before around, do you need the regulation? I mean, if we don't have the regulation that becomes best practice, is it done in the rigor that it needs to be? It feels like this new regulation is almost like specifying it in a lot more detail in terms of what you need to do to be more resilient. How do you start thinking about tolerance levels? How do you start thinking about assessing where the risk is and doing that? I mean, what's been the guidance around that?
I mean, as you say, firms should have done a fairly extensive BCP work before, and you would have had the sort of business impact assessment concepts within that. And even though the regulator would always say this is not business continuity, effectively the process is the same, and you should be looking at, because business impact assessment is what's my important business services, what's going to happen if it goes wrong, what do I need to do about it. So conceptually it is the same idea. I mean, in contrast probably to consumer duty, it wasn't as well signposted and guided. The idea that the expectation is that the firm will decide what is an important business service, the firm will decide the impact tolerances, which puts that great onus on the organisation.
I mean, how do you make a larger play within a company to say that this is important to increase its visibility when you're trying almost like insuring for something that may happen, and if you do it well, it won't happen? And how do you make the business case around that? I mean, avoiding regulation, non-compliance is one way of doing it, but I mean, how do you do that if that is not there? Because it does feel like it's good business practice. I
mean, the good business practice point is very important, and I mean, I wrote about this a while ago before the original regs came out, the idea of using the operational resilience as a operational improvement concept, because you look at online banking system goes down on payday, people can't get cash out the machines. I mean, these are public issues and issues in the confidence of organisations, and people these days using banking as an example, can switch bank accounts pretty quickly. So if you're not delivering service to customers, it will have a pound notes response.
I was reading the regulatory site, or the regulator's site earlier today. I was in preparation for this, and there was talk around conflict. I mean, it was particularly around the potential cyber attacks because of the war in Ukraine. I mean, how do we have to start thinking about some of those larger scale events potentially impacting us as well? I mean, is that something we need to factor in, or those sort of like out of scope? If you look at what's happened in some of those markets, I mean, there've been massive impacts. For example, if the internet goes down, what do you do? I mean, that's way bigger than a single firm.
Yeah, and it's thinking about the risk in a sufficiently broad manner. I mean, if you take cyber, for example, I've seen an awful lot of plans which have cyber, obviously they reference cyber, but it can be quite narrowly drawn. It can be somebody comes into our system and steals some money concepts, as opposed to we get a denial of service or ransomware in particular. There's somebody comes in and locks down our system, and then we can't do anything, and we have to pay a ransom. And if you are part of the infrastructure, if your service provides services for other companies, etc., then you can be in a situation of, I've got nothing else to do but pay up for this because my business is stopped at this moment in time. So thinking about your risks and pandemic is a classic example of that. We all thought in our business continuity plans that we'd be moving to our second offices.
Yeah.
That didn't quite work like that.
Yeah, I remember that in the BCP plans. We were all shipped off to an office somewhere else. But I mean, if you've got no staff, I mean, even now we've got through the pandemic and it feels like we're slowly getting back to normal. But if something else happens again and we can't go into the office, and let's say we lose a large proportion of our workforce, I mean, that's a bit of a nightmare scenario, isn't it? But you can build resiliency around that with digital processes.
Yeah, and most people did manage to muddle through, but it was probably a lot of luck rather than judgment. An awful lot of things that people ended up doing were not in the plans.
An interesting aside, how much do you think these plans, these regulatory changes, are impacted by our bias towards optimism? So in business, we seem to be quite biased towards optimism. So everything will work out. We will work through things, and often we do. And in fairness, we do. I mean, a lot of firms did work through the pandemic, but it almost feels like when we're talking about it, it's like we're being doom and gloom, talking about the world is going to fall apart and this is a disaster scenario that is unlikely to happen, hopefully, because it impacts us all, but it's something we need to think about and be resilient about. And it's very easy for us in firms just to say, brush that off as being a doomster and not being optimistic versus being pragmatic and realistic. Do you think that's a problem with adoption?
I think, I'll be slightly controversial here, but what the hell? I think there is a British trait of Dunkirk spirit.
Yeah.
And if you actually unpack Dunkirk as the example, wouldn't it be better if you better resourced your expeditionary force and considered what their exit plan was from that campaign you were doing, rather than rushing together lots of little boats and doing an incredibly successful rescue, but that wouldn't be your start point for any journey. So the idea that we can come together and fix a problem if a problem arises is a common trait and a common issue, as opposed to let's really think about what could go wrong here and put some controls in place.
And as we go back to the consumer duty element, do you think that comes down to culture? So certainly that's our culture to a certain extent, or human culture or human nature to a certain extent. But is it a cultural issue that we've got to change, and how do we make that change? Because I see it as being not being doom and gloom as much as being pragmatic. And let's be pragmatic around how we do it, and almost like logical around how we do it. I mean, how do we change that culture in firms, do you think?
I mean, again, slightly, when I talk about culture, I always use a sort of slightly Orwellian concept of culture as a lever of control. You need to be framing your culture in terms of the actions you want to achieve within the organisation and the behaviours you want to see, as opposed to all those sort of sun-bleached posters on the call centre wall. We're nice to our customers and all the rest of it, and we live our values. That's great. What does that actually mean in terms of reducing the risk in your organisation? So starting from a risk perspective, as we've said, and then thinking, okay, what levers can I pull, and how is culture part of those levers to pull to achieve these objectives?
And how do you go about assessing the culture? I mean, I know you do advisory work, but assessing the culture and then putting elements in to make those changes, because cultural change can be quite difficult, for all of us, really. I mean, what do you think? What's usually your recommendation?
I mean, in an organisation, in anywhere, culture is what happens when compliance and senior management are not in the room. So if back to our earlier point, if you step back from control and say, if I didn't have these controls in place, what would be happening in the organisation? That's your culture at the end of the day. So if you've got mis-selling going on, and the only way you can control mis-selling is a really heavy QA program and compliance reviewing all the calls, then you have a cultural problem within that organisation. So culture is behaviours. It's not what's in people's head. Well, yes, but the manifestation of it is in the behaviours.
Yeah. And do we do a good job around changing cultures? I mean, because we do see very heavy-handed kind of compliance programs that need to be there to make sure you're being compliant. I mean, if that's potentially a red flag or an indicator, let's say, of if the culture needs to improve, are we doing a good job of changing it, or is it tends to be difficult? We're just not at that point of the evolution yet.
It is, back to my earlier point, it's not really opening up the box and thinking what do I want my culture to do in this organisation, because I mean most people don't get up to work in the morning and think I'm going to rip off a lot of customers here. That's what I want to do, or they don't start their journey in the organisation thinking that. But due to poor oversight, and particularly due to things like rewards, remuneration, bonuses, they will go down that road. So those are part of your culture as well. So fixing those elements, pointing everything in the right direction, makes it much easier to start those softer messages of we're nice to our customers, blah, 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 we do this, we do that.
And the challenge is probably accumulation of lots of little things, isn't it, rather than one big thing that needs to be done. And I suppose coming back to consumer duty, I mean, I suppose that's the same in terms of processes, isn't it? I mean, I suppose like how do you make the accumulation of lots of little things throughout the process to then get to good customer outcomes? I'd imagine.
Yeah, and back to the sort of manufacturer distributor point. I mean, one thing I flag with firms is the concept of cultural alignment, because as we just articulated there, you think about the culture within your own organisation and how that can affect outcomes. Should you not be having that same conversation with your counterparties as well? I mean, manufacturer distributor, if you're not on the same page culturally as two organisations, no amount of due diligence or monthly reviews or anything like that are going to achieve the consumer duty requirements.
So we got the deadline that's coming in at the end of July. Where do you think we go to next from there? And imagine that just pragmatically there's going to be a series of reviews that happens after the summer in terms of looking at testing, making sure that people are compliant or that it's been implemented. But I mean, what do you think is going to happen?
I mean, the important thing on the firm side is not to take your foot off the gas, because as we said, realistically an awful lot of people are not going to be ready by July. So keep driving it, and also not thinking about it as a deadline, thinking about it as a slightly flowery sort of concept, a change of approach, ways of working. Embedding this in BAU is going to be the challenge. Back to our cultural point, this is forever going forward, or should be forever going forward. It's your new principle, as in the same way TCF was previously. So that is going to be a big challenge, certainly. Yeah.
Do you think there's measures you can put in place to measure that change of culture, or measure the evidencing there might be new measures to look at that? I mean, is there a way of us measuring the progress that we've made in terms of putting it in?
I mean, a practical way of doing it is measure it by customer outcomes. At the end of the day, I mean, that's the way the regulator's going to measure it. And thinking, I mean, I work with firms a lot on their MI and seeing not a lot of great progress on the MI side. It's the top up, bottom down. Top down is we've got a lot of MI, let's just give it to the board. Bottom up is, okay, fine, what are the requirements of consumer duty? Therefore, what metrics do we need to establish whether we're in line with those requirements or not? So building that model, building that change, getting the right MI, both like leading and lagging indicators, qualitative and quantitative indicators, and then capturing it, and obviously then giving it to senior management, and senior management demonstrating they're doing something about it.
Yeah, that does sound like quite a lot to do.
I mean, it is. I mean, if you go back and look at the finalised guidance and just go through what the regulator was saying, and there was a lot of it, you unpack all the questions, and I did this in a spreadsheet for my clients, all the questions they ask in that finalised guidance, and just ask yourself as an organisation, would I be comfortable sitting across from the regulator answering those questions?
Yeah. So if you're a firm, and let's say one of the firms listening to this, and you really haven't been up to speed on it yet, I mean, just being honest, when you're sitting there in a darkened room, being honest with yourself, and you think you've got to do more, and the deadline's pressing, what would you say the top 5 things that you would recommend they need to look at immediately, at least to start to get ready and put yourself in the best position possible for July?
I would start with that question list is a really useful prompt. So pull the questions out, or come and talk to somebody who's already done it, and then just go down that list and say, okay, tick tick tick. Oops, we haven't done this. Gives you a quick and dirty gap analysis of where you are in the organisation. So that kind of, have we grasped what consumer duty is for us? Second point is just making sure first liner fully engaged, and also first liner on the hook as well. I mean, responsibilities, job descriptions, roles, performance management, making sure this is real for first line, because we're the classic what gets measured gets done concept, and making sure you're focusing sufficient resource on this. If you are doing those important commercial projects at the same time, and that is to detriment to your consumer duty plan, that's potentially going to be a problem for you.
Yeah. Okay, that's some good guidance. And if you look at both of them, what we talked about, operational resilience and consumer duty, it feels like the regulators taking an increasingly more interventional type approach in the market. We've obviously got to get through the deadline at the end of July, but where do you think it goes from here? I mean, is this the new pattern? I mean, they're taking a much more involved approach with businesses on how to run your business and making them put in best practice to a certain extent. I mean, what that's been the direction of travel. Where do you think we go?
I think it is more interventionist, and it is, in some respects, making life easier for the regulator. I mean, I've done Section 166 skilled person work, and when you read those notices, they tend to be focused on breach of principle as opposed to breach of Rule 3.426, whatever, because that is easier for the regulator, because it's incredibly hard for anybody to challenge against a principle. So we now have, in July, they will be unwrapping of quite a big stick, and quite an easy stick for them to use, because, again, it's a principle. Think about foreseeable harm. What does that mean? It means what the regulator thinks it means at the end of the day. Do
you think there's other topics that will be picked on after this, or do you think it's just, I mean, the focus is let's go through this first before we look at anything else, or is it going to be circumstantial around how the world evolves?
I mean, in the retail space, in the consumer space, which they spend a lot of time focusing on, this is their big tentpole. This is the central tentpole for them. They're hanging pretty much everything else off that at the moment. So they will be, in my view, they will be using this as the driver for most of the regulatory activity going forward. And
one last question, I suppose, is I do have listeners that are outside of the UK, and they might say we don't have to worry about this, right? So, do the regulators talk between the different markets, and if you look at different regulatory regimes, how aligned do they tend to be? I don't know if you have visibility around that in terms of like aligning with each other as well.
Yeah, I mean, they absolutely do talk, and they have sort of college of regulator meetings and all the rest of it. I mean, maybe a slight shift since Brexit, but certainly with some of the, like the Australian regulators or the US regulators, there's still a fair bit of dialogue, and equally with obviously with the European colleagues as well. And they do look at good practice, and I suspect other regulators would probably be looking at this and thinking that seems like an efficient way of delivering outcomes. Obviously, that is balanced against commercial realities in jurisdictions. If you take the American jurisdiction, for example, which you mentioned at the start, maybe a little bit more entrepreneurial in their outlook, so maybe not something they'll be adopting, but other jurisdictions might be looking at it.
Yeah, so we might see similar kind of regulations coming in, albeit at different speeds and different markets, but similar kind of flavours. But I suppose it's worth thinking around how do you put these best practices in place now, because if it does come, even if it's in 5 years' time, then you've got the 3 or 5 years to basically get ready with some of the basic principles, because quick change seems hard, I think.
Yeah, and also recognising the commercial impact of this. I mean, there will be some products and some sales practices that you just simply won't be or shouldn't do after July. Some products you won't be able to sell to retail customers prudently after July, so there will be significant commercial impacts.
Yeah, Frank, thanks very much for the overview. It's fascinating. I always love hearing you chat. I mean, just a wealth of experience. So really appreciate it. And it does sound like that we've all got a work cut out for in what's only a couple of months, really. Yeah.
I mean, but back to the sort of ending on a positive or ending on a bit of positive. Do your best in the time you've got left.
Yeah. Okay, Frank, thanks very much.
All right, thanks a lot. See you later.